How one night destroyed the entire Arab coalition, Khalid's impossible raids. Imagine this. You're the commander of the most powerful alliance of Arab tribes ever assembled. You have 40,000 warriors under your command. You outnumber your enemy 4-1. Your camp stretches for miles, victory is guaranteed, and then, in the middle of the night, you hear it. Screams, fire, chaos. Your entire army is collapsing from within, and you don't even know what's happening. By morning, everything you built is gone. This isn't fiction. This actually happened. And the man who pulled it off? Khalid ibn al-Walid, the general who never lost a battle, the tactician who rewrote the rules of warfare. Tonight, we're diving into one of the most audacious military operations in history. A raid so brilliant, so impossibly daring, that it shattered an entire coalition in a single night. This is the story of how one man changed the course of history with nothing but genius, courage, and perfect timing. The year is 632. The Arabian Peninsula is in chaos. For centuries, these lands have been dominated by powerful tribal confederations. The Byzantines control the north. The Persians influence the east. And in between, dozens of Arab tribes compete for power, resources, and survival. But something has changed. A new force has emerged from Medina. The early Muslim community, led by Prophet Muhammad, has been growing rapidly. What started as a small religious movement has become a political and military power that threatens the old order, and the old order isn't happy about it. The traditional Arab tribes see this new faith as a threat to everything they know. Their way of life, their gods, their power structures, their economic systems built on pilgrimage to pagan shrines. So they do what empires and coalitions have always done when faced with an existential threat. They unite. Tribes that have been enemies for generations put aside their differences. They form the largest military alliance the Arabian Peninsula has ever seen. 40,000 warriors, the best fighters from the most powerful tribes, veterans who've spent their entire lives in warfare. They call themselves unstoppable. They probably are. Leading this coalition is a man named Tulayha. He's not just a warrior. He's a false prophet, someone claiming divine revelation to challenge the religious authority of Muhammad. He's charismatic, brilliant, and he commands absolute loyalty from his followers. Alongside him are tribal leaders whose names strike fear across Arabia, men who control vast territories and command thousands of riders. This isn't just an army, it's a statement, a declaration that the old ways will not die without a fight. The Muslim forces, by comparison, are dramatically outnumbered, maybe 10,000 fighters. Many of them are recent converts, lacking the battle experience of their opponents. Their equipment is basic, their resources limited. Any conventional military analysis would predict their total annihilation. But they have something the coalition doesn't. They have Khalid ibn al-Walid. Now, if you don't know who Khalid is, you need to understand something. This man is not normal. Khalid wasn't born into the Muslim community. He actually fought against them in the early wars. He was the general who nearly destroyed the Muslim army at the Battle of Uhud. His tactical genius caused devastating losses. He was, without question, the most dangerous enemy the early Muslims had. But then something happened. Khalid converted to Islam, and overnight the Muslims gained the greatest military mind in Arabia. Khalid's conversion wasn't just a religious awakening, it was a strategic earthquake. Imagine if, in the middle of World War II, Rommel had suddenly joined the Allies. That's the level of game-changer we're talking about. Khalid understood warfare in a way that transcended the conventional tactics of his time. He saw patterns others missed. He understood psychology. He knew how to read terrain, predict enemy movements, and exploit weaknesses that hadn't even formed yet. And now, facing this massive coalition army, he's about to prove exactly why he earned the title Saifullah. The Sword of God. The coalition army sets up camp at a place called Buzakha. It's a strong position. Open terrain that favors their superior numbers, multiple water sources, good sight lines. They're confident. Why wouldn't they be? They have 4 times as many fighters. They have experienced commanders. They have momentum. They're not expecting a fight, they're expecting a massacre. Their massacre. They plan to sweep through Muslim territories, destroy this upstart religious movement, and restore the old tribal order. Victory seems inevitable. But Khalid is watching, he's studying, he understands something fundamental about warfare that most commanders never grasp. Numbers don't win battles, morale does, cohesion does, and this massive coalition, for all its strength, has a fatal weakness. It's not really one army, it's dozens of tribes, each with their own agenda, their own pride, their own leadership structure. They're united by a common enemy, but that unity is fragile. It's built on mutual interest, not genuine loyalty. And Khalid sees this. He sees that if he can break their cohesion, their numbers become meaningless. So he develops a plan, not a conventional battle plan, something else entirely, something that requires perfect execution, incredible bravery, and a willingness to risk everything on a single audacious move. He's going to launch a night raid. But not just any night raid, he's going to strike at the heart of the enemy camp with a small, elite force. The goal isn't to defeat the coalition army in direct combat, that would be impossible. The goal is to create chaos, to shatter their sense of security, to turn their camp into a nightmare of confusion and panic, to make 40,000 warriors fear the darkness. Khalid selects his raiders carefully. These aren't just good fighters, they're the absolute best. Men who can move silently, who can fight in darkness, who won't panic when surrounded by enemies, who trust Khalid absolutely. Maybe a few hundred warriors total. That's it, a few hundred men preparing to infiltrate a camp of 40,000. The odds are insane. If they're discovered too early, they'll be slaughtered. If the coalition doesn't break, they'll be trapped behind enemy lines with no escape route. This isn't a tactical risk. This is a suicide mission that only works if everything goes perfectly. The night arrives. The coalition camp is settling down. Fires RN across the massive encampment. Sentries patrol, but they're not particularly worried. Why would they be? They have overwhelming numbers. The enemy is far away. They're safe. Or so they think. Under cover of darkness, Khalid and his raiders begin their approach. They move like ghosts, every step calculated, every sound controlled. They're not wearing heavy armor that would clink and clatter. They're dressed for stealth, for speed, for killing. They reach the outskirts of the camp. The sentries are dealt with silently. No alarms raised, no warnings given. Khalid's force slips into the camp like smoke, and then, at his signal, they strike. Fire arrows launch into tents, surprise attacks hit command positions, war cries erupt from multiple directions simultaneously. Suddenly the massive coalition camp is under attack from within. But here's the genius part. The raiders aren't trying to fight the entire army. They're targeting specific locations, leadership tents, supply depots, creating separate points of chaos across the camp. Confusion spreads like wildfire. Coalition warriors wake up to screams and flames. They grab their weapons, but they don't know where the enemy is. They can't see in the darkness. They hear fighting everywhere. Their commanders are under attack. Different tribes are shouting conflicting orders. Some think they're being attacked from outside. Others believe there's betrayal from within. The careful organization of the camp disintegrates. 40,000 warriors become 40,000 individuals trying to figure out what's happening. And Khalid's raiders are everywhere and nowhere. They strike a position, kill or wound as many as possible, then die, disappear before a counterattack can form. They target officers, spreading the rumor that the Muslim force specifically knows who the leaders are. They set fires that spread through supply tents, destroying food and weapons. They create the impression of a massive attacking force, much larger than it actually is. In the darkness and confusion, a few hundred raiders seem like thousands. The psychology is devastating. These coalition warriors came here feeling invincible. Now they're fighting for their lives in their own camp. They can't organize. They can't form defensive lines. They can't even identify the enemy. Friendly fire incidents start happening. One tribe mistakes another for enemies in the darkness and attacks them. old rivalries temporarily buried resurface under stress. The coalition starts fracturing. Tulaiha, the coalition leader, tries to restore order. He's shouting commands, trying to rally his forces, but his voice is one among thousands. The camp is massive. Most warriors can't even hear him, and the raids continue. Every time it seems like order might be restored, another section of the camp erupts in violence. Another fire starts. Another leader is killed. The night becomes endless, a nightmare that won't stop. What Khalid understands, what makes him a genius, is that humans have a breaking point. Courage is finite. When you're exhausted, terrified, unable to see the enemy, watching your friends die around you, unable to tell friend from foe, eventually your mind makes a decision. Survival trumps everything else, and that decision spreads. One warrior breaks and runs, then another, then 10, then 100. By the time dawn approaches, the coalition on camp is in total collapse. Units are fleeing in different directions. Tribes are abandoning the alliance to save themselves. The command structure has disintegrated. 40,000 warriors have become a scattered mob of refugees, and they've barely even seen the enemy. Khalid's raiders, having accomplished their mission, withdraw. Their casualties are remarkably light. They've achieved the impossible. They've destroyed an army 4 times their size without fighting a conventional battle. But Khalid isn't done. This is where his genius becomes truly apparent. He knows that a routed army is more vulnerable than an organized one. So as dawn breaks and his raiders return, he immediately orders a pursuit. The main Muslim force, which has been held in reserve, now advances. But they're not chasing a powerful coalition, they're chasing broken remnants. Warriors who are exhausted, demoralized, separated from their units. The coalition that seemed unstoppable the day before no longer exists as a fighting force. The pursuit becomes a rout. Coalition warriors who stayed behind to fight are overwhelmed by organized attacks. Those who fled are hunted down by cavalry. The tribes that formed this grand alliance scatter back to their territories, their unity shattered beyond repair. Tulaiha, the false prophet who led them, is completely discredited. His followers abandon him. The tribal leaders who pledged to fight together now refuse to even speak to each other, each blaming the others for the disaster. Now let's dive deeper into what made Khalid such an extraordinary figure. Before we talk more about the battle itself, we need to understand the man. Khalid wasn't some peasant who rose through the ranks through luck. He was born into the Quraysh tribe, one of the most powerful families in Mecca. He was trained as a warrior from childhood. His father was a military commander. His entire upbringing prepared him for warfare. But here's what's interesting. Many men receive elite training. Many are born into military families. Very few become legendary commanders. What separated Khalid from everyone else? First, he had an analytical mind that treated warfare as a science, not just an art. Most commanders of his era relied heavily on courage, personal prowess, and straightforward tactics. Cavalry charges, shield walls, overwhelming force at the point of contact. Khalid studied the deeper patterns. He understood logistics, the science of keeping armies supplied and mobile. He grasped the importance of intelligence gathering, knowing not just where the enemy was, but what they were thinking and planning. He recognized that battles were won before the fighting started through positioning, timing, and psychological preparation. Second, Khalid possessed extraordinary situational awareness. In the chaos of ancient battle, where there's no radar, no radio, no way to see the whole battlefield except from your own limited perspective, commanders often lost track of what was happening. Units would become separated, flanks would collapse without anyone noticing until too late. Reserves would sit unused because the commander didn't realize they were needed. Khalid somehow maintained a mental map of the entire battlefield. He knew where his units were. He anticipated where the enemy would move next. He saw opportunities develop before they fully formed. This isn't something you can teach. It's a rare gift that only the greatest military minds possess. Third, and this is crucial, Khalid understood that warfare is fundamentally about people. He knew his own warriors. He understood what motivated them, what scared them, what would make them fight harder. And he understood his enemies the same way. He could predict how coalition commanders would react under pressure. He knew which tribal leaders were brave and which would run when things got difficult. He recognized that every army is a collection of individuals with hopes and fears, and if you understand those psychological factors, you can manipulate outcomes in ways that purely physical tactics never could. Let's also consider the context of Arabian warfare in this period. The Arabian Peninsula was home to warrior cultures that had perfected desert combat over centuries. These weren't amateur fighters. These were men who grew up riding horses and camels before they could walk, who practiced with swords and spears from childhood, who understood desert navigation, survival, and combat tactics as naturally as we understand driving cars or using smartphones. The military sophistication of Arabian warriors is often underestimated in Western history, but these were elite fighters by any standard. What made Arabian warfare unique was its emphasis on mobility and individual combat skill. European warfare of the same period focused on heavy infantry formations, discipline, holding the line. Arabian warfare was fluid, cavalry raids, quick strikes, maneuvering for advantage. Warriors were expected to show personal bravery and skill in single combat. This cultural context meant that armies were collections of individually skilled fighters rather than disciplined units moving in formation. And this cultural reality created both strengths and weaknesses that a clever commander could exploit. The strength was that Arabian warriors were incredibly dangerous individually. Put a skilled Arabian horseman in a fluid battle situation, and he was deadly. Fast, agile, experienced, and motivated by personal honor to fight courageously. The weakness was that these armies lacked the rigid discipline of Roman legions or later professional armies. They were harder to control, harder to maneuver as units, more prone to breaking formation to pursue personal glory. A commander who understood these cultural factors could turn them to his advantage. Khalid understood this perfectly. He knew that Arabian armies fought fiercely when confident, but could collapse rapidly when their confidence broke. He knew that tribal pride meant different groups within a coalition army would compete rather than cooperate under stress. He knew that individual warriors valued personal honor and survival, and if you made the cost of continuing to fight seem higher than the cost of retreat, they would choose retreat without shame. These insights informed everything about the Buzakha raid. He wasn't trying to kill all 40,000 warriors, he was trying to break their confidence and trigger a cultural response where individual and tribal survival took precedence over coalition unity. Let's return to the raid itself and examine it in even more detail. The preparation phase would have been extensive. Khalid and his officers would have spent days or weeks gathering intelligence about the coalition's camp. They would have sent scouts disguised as travelers or traders to observe the camp layout. They would have interrogated prisoners or deserters to learn about coalition leadership, morale, and routine. They would have studied the terrain around the camp to identify the best approach routes and escape paths. Every detail mattered because one mistake would mean death for everyone involved. The raiders themselves would have gone through intense preparation. They would have practiced moving silently in darkness. They would have rehearsed their attack patterns. They would have memorized the camp layout as described by scouts. They would have discussed contingencies. What happens if we're discovered early? What happens if the enemy organizes a counterattack? What's our rally point if we get separated? Modern special operations forces spend months preparing for missions. Khalid's raiders probably spent weeks. The attention to detail would have been obsessive because their lives depended on it. The approach to the camp would have been terrifying, walking through darkness toward an enemy camp containing 40,000 warriors, knowing that one mistake, one sound, one unlucky patrol encounter means fighting against impossible odds. The raiders would have moved in complete silence. No talking, communication by hand signals only. each man trusting that the others were maintaining position, were staying quiet, were ready for what came next. This requires discipline that goes beyond normal military training. This requires a mindset where fear is acknowledged but controlled, where survival instinct is overridden by mission focus and trust in your brothers. When they reached the camp perimeter, the first challenge was dealing with sentries without raising an alarm. Ancient armies didn't have night vision goggles or motion sensors. They relied on human sentries with human limitations. Sentries get tired. They get bored. They focus on obvious threats and miss subtle ones. Khalid's raiders would have been experts at exploiting these limitations, approaching from downwind so scent wouldn't alert guard dogs, moving during moments when sentries were looking elsewhere, using darkness and terrain features for concealment, when necessary, eliminating sentries silently through strangulation or knife work that prevented any outcry. Once inside the camp, the raid unfolded in phases. The first phase was infiltration, getting all the raiders into position without detection. This might have taken an hour or more. Patient movement from one shadow to another, freezing in place when anyone passed nearby, gradually spreading throughout the camp until attack teams were positioned near key targets. The tension during this phase must have been incredible, every moment risking discovery, every second wondering if this was when someone would notice and sound the alarm. The second phase was the initial strike. On Khalid's signal, probably a specific sound or action visible across the camp, all teams attacked simultaneously. Fire arrows arcing into the darkness to land on tents, sudden violence at command positions, war cries erupting from multiple directions. This simultaneity was crucial. If attacks happened sequentially, the camp might have time to organize. By hitting everywhere at once, Khalid ensured maximum confusion and prevented any organized response from forming. The third phase was sustained chaos. This is where the raiders' discipline really showed. It would have been easy to get caught up in fighting, to stay in one position trying to kill as many enemies as possible, but that would have gotten them surrounded and killed. Instead, they had to maintain tactical mobility, hit a target, cause casualties and confusion, then break contact and move to the next position before enemy reinforcements arrived. This requires incredible discipline and spatial awareness. In darkness, in a chaotic environment, with enemies all around, maintaining unit cohesion while constantly moving is extraordinarily difficult. The fourth phase was withdrawal. At some point, probably as dawn approached, Khalid signaled that it was time to leave. The raiders had to disengage from contact, reassemble and exit the camp while it was still in chaos. This is often the most dangerous phase of a raid. You've accomplished your mission, but you're tired, possibly wounded, and now you have to escape through an enemy force that's starting to organize. The key was timing the withdrawal so that coalition forces were still too confused and disorganized to mount an effective pursuit. Throughout all of this, think about what individual raiders experienced. Fighting in near-total darkness against enemies who vastly outnumber you, hearing screams and combat all around, not knowing if your friends are alive or dead, having to trust your training and your commander absolutely because there's no time for doubt or hesitation. This is why elite units develop such strong bonds. They've been through shared experiences that transcend normal human experience. They've trusted a other with their lives, and that trust was validated. They've accomplished missions that seemed impossible. That creates loyalty that can't be broken. The strategic implications are enormous. This wasn't just a military victory. It was a psychological demolition. Every tribe in Arabia hears about what happened at Buzakha. They learn that 40,000 warriors were destroyed by a much smaller force. They learn that Khalid ibn al-Walid can strike anywhere, anytime, that numbers don't protect you, that being confident isn't the same as being safe. The reputation of the Muslim forces grows exponentially. Other tribes that were considering rebellion suddenly think twice. Some switch sides entirely. But there's another layer to this that we need to explore. The raid at Buzakha didn't just break an army, it broke a narrative. The coalition had built itself on a story that said the old ways were strong, that the new faith was weak, that tradition and numbers would inevitably triumph over innovation and determination. That story gave the coalition members confidence. It helped them recruit warriors. It made other tribes hesitant to oppose them. The story was their foundation. And in one night, Khalid shattered that story so completely that it could never be rebuilt. This is something that modern military strategists call narrative warfare. The battles we remember aren't always the biggest or bloodiest. They're the ones that change how people think. The Battle of Thermopylae wasn't strategically decisive, but it created a narrative about Spartan courage that influenced Western civilization for millennia. The Battle of Britain wasn't fought with the largest forces, but it created a narrative about resilience that defined how people saw World War II. Buzakha created a narrative that the Muslim forces were not just another tribal power, they were something new, something that could not be defeated through conventional means. And that narrative changed everything. Think about how this played out across Arabia. Tribal councils meeting to discuss their options, elders debating whether to fight or negotiate, young warriors wondering if they should answer calls to arms against the Muslims. In every one of these conversations, someone would bring up Buzakha. Remember what happened to Tulaiha's coalition? 40,000 warriors destroyed in a single night. Do we really want to fight someone who can do that? This psychological impact achieved what decades of conventional warfare might not have. It convinced potential enemies that fighting was futile. There's also a religious dimension we should acknowledge. For Muslims, Khalid's victory at Buzakha was seen as divine validation. The title Saifullah, Sword of God, wasn't just military respect, it was religious recognition that Khalid was an instrument of divine will. This belief enhanced his effectiveness as a commander. His troops fought with the confidence that God was on their side, that their cause was righteous, that victory was predestined. Whether you believe in divine intervention or not, the psychological effect of that belief was real and powerful. For the coalition warriors, this created a terrible double bind. They weren't just fighting a brilliant general, they were fighting someone their enemies believed had divine support. And after what happened at Buzakha, it was hard to argue against that belief. How else do you explain a few hundred men destroying 40,000? In an age where the line between natural and supernatural was blurrier than it is today, Khalid's achievement seemed to validate the religious claims his side was making. This added a spiritual dimension to military defeat that made it even more devastating. Let's also examine what happened to the coalition survivors. These men returned to their tribes carrying not just military defeat, but psychological trauma. They had experienced something that violated their understanding of how warfare worked. They had felt invincible and then felt helpless. That kind of experience changes people. Some would have struggled with what we now call PTSD, reliving the chaos and terror of that night. Others would have lost their confidence as warriors, always wondering if the next battle would bring similar disaster. Some would have questioned their entire worldview, wondering if the gods they worshipped were weaker than the God the Muslims followed. The tribal leaders who organized the coalition faced political consequences as well. They had promised their people victory. They had gathered warriors, consumed resources, made bold predictions, and they had failed catastrophically. In tribal cultures where leadership depends on demonstrated competence and success, this kind of failure was career-ending. Some leaders were replaced. Others lost influence and prestige. A few probably faced death, either in battle or through political retribution from their own people. The coalition's defeat didn't just scatter warriors, it reshuffled the entire political structure of Arabia. Meanwhile, Khalid's reputation continued to grow. After Buzakha, he led campaigns throughout Arabia, defeating every enemy force he encountered. He was then sent to fight the Persian Empire, one of the great superpowers of the ancient world. The Persians had been a dominant force for centuries. They had vast resources, professional armies, and sophisticated military tactics. They expected to crush the Arab forces easily. They didn't account for Khalid ibn al-Walid. Battle after battle, Khalid outmaneuvered and defeated Persian commanders who had vastly more resources. He turned seemingly hopeless situations into victories through tactical brilliance and psychological warfare. Then came the Byzantine Empire, the other superpower of the era. The Byzantines were the successors to Rome. They had inherited Roman military doctrine, training, and equipment. They fielded massive armies with heavy infantry, cavalry, and siege equipment. They were, by any objective measure, one of the most powerful military forces on earth, and Khalid beat them. The Battle of Yarmouk in 636 CE was the decisive engagement. A Byzantine army estimated at over 100,000 warriors against a Muslim force less than half that size. The terrain favored the Byzantines. They had better equipment, they had numerical superiority, and they lost. Khalid used tactical flexibility, terrain advantage, and psychological pressure to shatter one of the greatest armies of the ancient world. What's remarkable about Khalid's career is not just that he won battles, it's that he kept winning against increasingly powerful enemies using increasingly innovative tactics. He never rested on his laurels. He never said, "Well, this worked or so I'll just repeat it." Every battle saw new approaches, new tactical innovations, new ways of applying psychological pressure and exploiting enemy weaknesses. He evolved as a commander throughout his career, always learning, always improving, always finding new ways to do the impossible. But let's return to Buzakha one more time, because it encapsulates everything that made Khalid extraordinary. The willingness to take calculated risks, the understanding of human psychology, the meticulous preparation, the personal courage to lead from the front, the ability to inspire others to achieve beyond what they thought possible. All of these elements came together in one perfect operation that changed the course of history. There's a final lesson here that applies far beyond military history. Khalid succeeded because he refused to accept conventional wisdom about what was possible. Everyone knew you couldn't defeat 40,000 warriors with a few hundred raiders. Everyone knew that coalitions with overwhelming numerical superiority didn't just collapse overnight. Everyone knew the rules of warfare, and Khalid's plan violated all of them. But Khalid didn't care about everyone knew. He cared about what could actually be done if you were smart enough, brave enough, and determined enough. This is relevant to us today in ways that might not be immediately obvious. We live in a world full of people telling us what's impossible. You can't start that business, the market is too competitive. You can't learn that skill, it's too difficult. You can't achieve that goal, the obstacles are too large. And sometimes those people are right. But sometimes they're wrong, sometimes impossible. That just means nobody's figured it out yet. Sometimes the obstacles that seem insurmountable are actually quite vulnerable if you attack them from an unexpected angle. Sometimes what everyone knows is wrong. Khalid teaches us that genius isn't about being smarter than everyone else in conventional ways. It's about seeing what others miss. It's about questioning assumptions. It's about having the courage to try approaches that seem crazy until they work. How many innovations throughout history started with people saying it can't be done? How many world-changing ideas were dismissed as impossible before someone proved they weren't? How many victories were achieved by commanders who refused to accept that the odds were too long? The raid at Buzakha works as a metaphor for any seemingly impossible challenge. You're outnumbered, you're out-resourced, conventional approaches won't work. What do? You study the problem until you understand it better than anyone else. You identify weaknesses others overlook. You prepare meticulously. You find people who share your vision and trust them completely, and then you execute with absolute commitment, holding nothing back, because halfway measures don't achieve impossible things. That's what Khalid did. That's what every person who's accomplished the impossible has done. There's also something to be said about the importance of timing. Khalid launched his raid at exactly the right moment, earlier, and the coalition might not have been complacent enough. Later, and they might have improved their security. He understood that opportunities are time-sensitive. that there are moments when conditions align in ways that make the impossible possible. And if you miss those moments, they don't come back. This is true in warfare, in business, in relationships, in life. Success often depends not just on doing the right thing, but on doing it at the right time. And finally, let's talk about legacy. Khalid ibn al-Walid died in 642 CE, probably in his late 50s. He died in bed, which amazed him given how many battles he'd fought. He reportedly said something like, "I've fought in dozens of battles. Every part of my body bears scars from wounds, and yet here I am dying in my bed like a camel." He had wanted to die in combat, as a warrior should. But fate had other plans. His legacy, though, that lived on. For Muslims, he remains one of the greatest military commanders in history. For military historians of all backgrounds, he studied as an example of tactical genius and innovative warfare. Within months, the coalition that was supposed to crush the Muslim community is completely disbanded. The tribes return to their territories. Many of them negotiate peace. Some convert to Islam. The ones that continue resisting do so individually, without the support of a united front, and they're picked off one by one. The entire political landscape of Arabia shifts because of one night, one impossible raid, one brilliant commander who understood that breaking an enemy's spirit is more effective than breaking their bodies. Let's take a moment to understand what made this raid so extraordinary from a military perspective. Throughout history, commanders have launched night raids. It's a common tactic. But what Khalid did was different. Most night raids are hit-and-run operations against specific targets, supply lines, outposts, STS, small detachments. You strike fast, cause damage, and retreat before the enemy can respond. What you don't do is infiltrate the main camp of an army that outnumbers you 4-1. That's not tactics, that's suicide. Except Khalid understood something about mass psychology that most commanders miss. Large armies are powerful, but they're also complex systems with multiple failure points. Communication becomes difficult. Command structures get stretched thin. Different units develop their own cultures and priorities. And all of that creates vulnerabilities. A large army at rest is actually quite fragile if you know where to apply pressure. Khalid knew that he didn't need to defeat 40,000 warriors in combat, he just needed to prevent them from fighting as a cohesive unit. And the best way to do that was to attack their sense of security and order. The raid targeted leadership specifically. In armies of that era, command and control depended entirely on personal authority. There were no radios, no field phones, no way to transmit orders quickly across a large force. If you killed or scattered the commanders, their units became leaderless. Khalid's raiders weren't randomly attacking, they were surgically removing the command structure. Every officer they killed created a unit that couldn't receive orders. Every leadership tent they destroyed created a hole in the organizational chain. By dawn, the coalition didn't just lack morale, it literally lacked the ability to function as an army. The use of fire was also brilliant. Fire does more than cause physical damage. It creates panic, it spreads unpredictably, it forces people to make immediate decisions without time to think. When sections of the camp started burning, coalition warriors had to choose between fighting the raiders and saving their equipment and supplies. Many chose the latter, which further fragmented the defensive response. And because fire produces smoke and light, it actually made the darkness worse for the coalition. They were blinded by their own burning camp, while Khalid's raiders, who knew the terrain and had planned their movements, could navigate effectively. The timing of the raid was perfect too. Khalid struck in the deepest part of the night. This is when human alertness is at its lowest, when reaction times are slowest, when the body wants to sleep regardless of what the mind demands. The coalition sentries were tired. The warriors were in deep sleep. Even after the attack began, it took time for people to fully wake up, understand what was happening, and respond effectively. Those precious minutes of confusion were all Khalid needed to create irreversible chaos. And then there's the psychological operation Khalid ran. By attacking from multiple directions, he created the impression of a much larger force. Coalition warriors, unable to see clearly in the darkness, estimated the enemy numbers based on the scale of the attack. If there's fighting on the north side of camp and the south side and the east side, your brain assumes there must be thousands of enemies. It doesn't occur to you that it might be the same few hundred raiders moving quickly between positions. This is psychological warfare at its finest, making the enemy defeat themselves through their own fear and confusion. But let's also talk about the courage this required. Khalid's raiders knew the stakes. If the raid failed, if they were discovered and surrounded, they would die. There would be no rescue, no retreat, 40,000 enemies between them and safety. Every man who volunteered for this mission understood he might not see another sunrise. That level of courage, that willingness to trust your commander so completely that you'll walk into almost certain death, that's what separates legendary units from ordinary soldiers. Khalid commanded loyalty not through fear or manipulation, but through competence and shared risk. He wasn't sending men into danger, he was leading them into it. After the Battle of Buzakha, Khalid's reputation reached mythical status. Other commanders studied his tactics. Poets composed verses about the impossible raid. Veterans told stories around campfires of the night the great coalition fell. But more importantly, the balance of power in Arabia fundamentally shifted. Before Buzakha, the Muslim community was one force among many, respected but not dominant. After Buzakha, they became the dominant military power in the region. Tribes that had been considering which side to support suddenly saw a clear winner. This is what decisive victories look like. They don't just change the immediate tactical situation, they change the entire strategic landscape. They influence decisions made hundreds of miles away by people who weren't even at the battle. When tribal leaders across Arabia heard what happened at Buzakha, they recalculated their options. Some decided that fighting was pointless. Others decided that joining was advantageous. The Muslim community gained allies and neutralized enemies without fighting additional battles because of the psychological impact of one incredible night. Khalid went on to even greater achievements after this. He led campaigns against the Byzantine Empire and the Persian Empire, the two superpowers of the era. He commanded forces in some of the most significant battles in early Islamic history. The Battle of Yarmouk, where he defeated a Byzantine army that massively outnumbered his force. The conquest of Damascus. The campaigns in Iraq and Syria. He fought dozens of battles and never lost. Not once. That's not luck. That's genius paired with discipline paired with courage. What makes Khalid particularly fascinating is that he represents something rarely seen in history. He was a tactical innovator. Most great generals are great because they execute known strategies brilliantly. They read the classics, study previous battles, and apply proven methods with skill and timing. Khalid did that, but he also invented new approaches. The night raid at Buzakha wasn't something he learned from a manual. It was something he created based on his understanding of psychology, terrain, and human nature. He looked at an impossible situation and asked not how to win a conventional battle, but how to make conventional battle irrelevant. This is a pattern throughout military history. The greatest commanders don't just fight better, they fight differently. Alexander the Great used combined arms tactics that his enemies couldn't counter. Hannibal pulled off strategic surprises, like crossing the Alps with elephants. Napoleon revolutionized warfare with core systems and rapid maneuver. Khalid ibn al-Walid understood that warfare is ultimately about will, not strength. If you break the enemy's will to fight, their weapons and numbers become meaningless. The raid at Buzakha also demonstrates something crucial about leadership. Khalid didn't just plan this operation, he convinced hundreds of men to execute it. Think about that conversation. You're a warrior in Khalid's army. He calls you aside and says, "We're going to sneak into an enemy camp of 40,000 warriors in the middle of the night with a few hundred men and cause chaos until their army collapses." Your first reaction would probably be to check if he's serious. Your second would be to question his sanity. But somehow, Khalid convinced men to do this. That requires a level of trust and respect that goes beyond normal military hierarchy. Great leaders earn that trust through consistency. They don't ask soldiers to take risks they wouldn't take themselves. They don't make promises they can't keep. They don't sacrifice men unnecessarily. Khalid had already proven his competence in previous battles. He had shown that his unconventional tactics worked. He had demonstrated personal courage by fighting alongside his men rather than directing from safety. So when he proposed this insane raid, his warriors trusted him. They knew he wouldn't waste their lives. They knew he had thought through every detail. They knew that if anyone could pull this off, it was Khalid. That trust is what makes elite units possible. Regular soldiers follow orders out of duty or fear or habit. Elite soldiers follow orders out of belief. They believe in their commander, they believe in their mission, they believe in each other. And that belief transforms them into something more effective than the sum of their individual skills. The raiders at Buzakha weren't just good fighters. They were good fighters who trusted each other completely and who would rather die than let their brothers down. That's the difference between an army and a brotherhood. Let's also consider the aftermath from the coalition's perspective. Imagine you're a warrior who survived Buzakha. You came to this battle confident. You were part of the largest military force in Arabia. You knew you were going to win. Then one night happens. One terrible, chaotic, nightmarish night where everything falls apart. Your commanders are dead or missing. Your camp is burning. Your tribe is scattered. By morning, the great army is gone. You're running for your life. How do you process that? How do you explain to your family and your tribe that you were part of a massive force that got destroyed by a smaller enemy you barely even saw? The psychological trauma of that experience would be profound. These warriors would carry the memory of that night for the rest of their lives. And when they tell their stories, they spread Khalid's reputation. Every survivor becomes a walking advertisement for why you don't fight Khalid ibn al-Walid. This is how legends are built, not through propaganda but through actual achievements that are so extraordinary that people can't help but talk about them. The coalition warriors who survived Buzakha probably exaggerated their stories, making the raid seem even more terrifying than it was, and those exaggerations worked in Khalid's favor, adding to the mystique that made future enemies afraid before battles even began. There's also a strategic lesson here about coalition warfare. Throughout history, coalitions have often been less effective than they appear on paper. The coalition wars against Napoleon, the alliances in World War I, the coalition against ISIS. Getting different groups to fight together is incredibly difficult because each group has its own priorities, leadership styles, and cultural norms. What looks like strength, massive combined forces, can actually be weakness if the coalition fractures under pressure. The Arab coalition at Buzakha had this weakness baked in. Different tribes with different agendas held together by temporary common interest. Khalid didn't need to defeat each tribe individually. He just needed to break the bonds holding them together. This is why coalition leaders obsess over unity and cohesion. They know that their combined force is only as strong as their weakest link. If one member breaks, others might follow. It becomes a cascade. The Romans understood this when they fought Gallic coalitions. The British understood this when they managed alliances against France. Khalid understood it at Buzakha. He targeted the coalition's cohesion, and once that broke, the entire structure collapsed. This is a lesson that remains relevant in modern geopolitics. Coalitions are powerful but fragile. They require constant maintenance, and a smart opponent will always probe for fractures. Looking at this battle from a modern military perspective, we can see elements that remain relevant today. The importance of morale and psychological warfare, the value of special operations forces conducting raids behind enemy lines, the effectiveness of disrupting command and control, the way that reputation and fear can be force multipliers. Modern militaries study historical battles, not because they want to recreate them, but because they reveal timeless principles about conflict, leadership, and human behavior under stress. Buzakha is taught in military academies because it demonstrates these principles perfectly. The raid also shows the importance of intelligence and preparation. Khalid didn't just randomly attack the coalition camp, he studied it. He knew where the leadership tents were. He understood the layout. He identified the best infiltration routes. He timed his attack for maximum effect. This is what distinguishes successful special operations from suicidal ones: planning, intelligence, preparation, and then perfect execution based on that groundwork. The raiders knew exactly where they were going and what they needed to do. There was no fumbling in the darkness hoping for the best. Every move was calculated. Another aspect worth considering is how this battle influenced Khalid's future operations. Success breeds confidence. After Buzakha, Khalid knew that unconventional tactics could defeat superior numbers. He knew that psychological operations could be as effective as combat. He knew that taking calculated risks could produce extraordinary results. This knowledge influenced how he approached subsequent battles. He became even more creative, even more willing to try innovative approaches. The Battle of Yarmouk, where he used the terrain and tactical flexibility to defeat a much larger Byzantine force, shows similar creative thinking. Buzakha wasn't just a victory, it was a proving ground for methods that Khalid would use throughout his career. We should also talk about the human cost. War, even brilliantly executed war, means death and suffering. The coalition warriors who died at Buzakha were people. They had families, dreams, reasons for fighting that made sense to them. They weren't evil. They were men defending what they believed was right, protecting their way of life against what they saw as a threat. History tends to focus on the winners, on the brilliant commanders, and the victorious armies. But every battle leaves behind broken bodies and grieving families. That's the tragedy of war. Even necessary conflicts create enormous human suffering. Khalid himself understood this. By all accounts, he was a fierce warrior, but not a cruel one. He gave terms to enemies who surrendered. He protected civilians. He followed the rules of war as they existed in his time. The raid at Buzakha was devastating, but it was also relatively quick. The psychological collapse of the coalition prevented a prolonged battle that would have killed many more people on both sides. In a terrible calculus that commanders have always had to make, a sharp, decisive victory often causes less total suffering than a drawn-out conflict. That doesn't make it good, it just makes it less awful than the alternative. The story of Buzakha also reminds us that individuals can change history. One brilliant commander with the courage to attempt the impossible altered the fate of an entire region. If Khalid had played it safe, if he had refused to take the risk, if he had fought a conventional battle, the outcome might have been very different. The coalition might have won. The political landscape of Arabia might have developed along completely different lines. But he didn't play it safe. He looked at an impossible situation and found a way through. That's what great leaders do. They see possibilities others miss. There's something deeply inspiring about that, even across 14 centuries. We live in a world that often feels like it runs on inexorable forces. Economics, technology, demographics, systems so large that individual actions seem meaningless. But history shows us that individuals matter, decisions matter, courage matters. One person with vision and determination can create changes that ripple through time. Khalid didn't have advanced technology or overwhelming resources. He had intellect, courage, and the ability to inspire others to follow him into the impossible, and that was enough to change the world. As we wrap up, let's remember the key elements that made this raid legendary. Strategic vision. Khalid understood that conventional battle wasn't the answer. Tactical innovation. He created an approach that his enemies couldn't counter. Perfect execution. The raid was carried out flawlessly despite enormous risk. Psychological warfare. He attacked enemy morale and cohesion rather than just their bodies. And leadership. He convinced warriors to follow him into almost certain death because they trusted him completely. These elements combined to create one of the most remarkable military operations in history. The night at Buzakha reminds us that warfare is ultimately about people, not things. It's about will, courage, fear, loyalty, and leadership. Technology and numbers matter, but they're not decisive. What's decisive is the human element, the men and women making decisions under pressure, the leaders inspiring others to achieve the impossible, the warriors finding courage they didn't know they had. That's where battles are won and lost. That's where history is made. Khalid ibn al-Walid stands as one of history's greatest military commanders. He fought over 100 battles without a single defeat. He innovated tactics that influenced warfare for generations. He turned impossible situations into victories through brilliance and courage. But perhaps his greatest achievement was showing that genius isn't about following the rules perfectly. It's about knowing when to break them. It's about seeing opportunities others miss. It's about having the courage to attempt what conventional wisdom says is impossible. The raid at Buzakha was impossible. A few hundred raiders against 40,000 warriors, infiltrating their camp, creating chaos, shattering an entire coalition in one night. It couldn't be done, except it was. Because one commander refused to accept that impossible means impossible, he found a way, he executed it perfectly, and he changed history in the process. That's the real lesson of this story. Impossible just means nobody's figured it out yet. The limits we accept are often artificial. The boundaries we respect are often imagined, airy. And sometimes all it takes is one person with enough vision and courage to prove that what everyone thought was impossible was just difficult. So the next time you face something that seems impossible, remember Khalid at Buzakha. Remember that odds don't determine outcomes, that numbers don't win battles, that the impossible is just the unexplored, and that with enough intelligence, courage, and determination, one person really can change everything. That's the legacy of Khalid ibn al-Walid. That's the lesson of the impossible raid. And that's why, 14 centuries later, we're still talking about one extraordinary night when a few hundred warriors destroyed an army of 40,000 and changed the course of history forever. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most brilliant military operations, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We've got more incredible stories coming your way. Stories of impossible victories, brilliant strategies, and the extraordinary people who refuse to accept defeat. Drop a comment below and let me know what historical battle or commander you want me to cover next. And remember, history isn't just about what happened. It's about what's possible. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.